Hello and welcome to the Pastor's Study. I wanted to take a little bit of time today and talk about something which actually relates to something pretty close to the topic I had for a couple of weeks ago. That was of living as dual citizens, or what was sometimes called the two kingdoms. And that is the topic of vocation or calling. The question that people often ask is, what is my calling, or what is my vocation, or what is God calling me to do? And there's a lot of different ways of thinking about vocation or talking about vocation, and I'm going to name a couple of them that I don't think. I mean, while they're not entirely wrong, I don't think they quite get the fullness of what we're talking about with vocation. So one of the ways is sometimes we use vocation very simply just to speak about our job, our occupation, right? So I might say, well, you might say that your vocation is, working as a teacher, or my vocation is working as a pastor, or whatever it is, driving a bus, or doing janitorial work, or whatever your occupation, whatever it is that you get paid to do, that we talk about that as our vocation. So we use the term vocational training, for example, to refer to this sort of thing. And while that's not wrong, certainly these things are vocations. It's much too narrow to think of the word vocation just as the thing that you do in order to make money, right? Vocation is far too narrow, or that's far too narrow a definition of vocation. There's another version of vocation, which is sort of goes the opposite. So if that's too small, there's another one that tries to take this idea of a vocation, a singular calling of God on your life, and tries to make it into the one big thing that you are called to do with your life. So there's a quote, I can't remember who the quote's attributed to. You maybe have heard it before, but it's, and I'm going to butcher it, I'm sure, but it's something along the lines of vocation or calling is where your deep joy meets the world's deep need. So it's this idea that, where you are gifted for, and where you enjoy putting in your time and energy in a helpful way, and where that need is active in the world, that's what we think of as vocation. And so sometimes when we talk about vocation this way, it means that, well, our job then is to sort of figure out what our vocation is, what our calling is, especially when we're young, right? When we're in high school or in college, there's a lot of thinking about what will your vocation be? What will the big impact you make on the world be? What will it be, that one, singular calling which you are fulfilling, that you are uniquely suited to, and which the world is uniquely in need of? And again, it's not a bad definition necessarily. I mean, it's true. We are called to use our unique gifts in ways that serve the world in the way that the world needs. I mean, that is a calling, that is vocation. But it takes one aspect of it and blows it up to be the entire thing, as though your whole life's purpose, your whole life's goal is simply to figure out what that one thing, what your true purpose in life is, and to fulfill that vocation. And it ends up actually, I think it's supposed to, the idea of that definition is it's supposed to help people identify where God is calling them, but it ends up sort of actually creating a lot of anxiety and sort of locking people out of this idea of being called by God, where if they can't find that one thing that they're so uniquely suited for and that the world is so uniquely in need of, that maybe they don't have a vocation, maybe they're not called by God, or maybe they failed in some ways to find it. And so in contrast to both of those, idea of a singular vocation, whether it's what you do in order to be paid, or the one big impact you'll have on the world, I want to advance a Lutheran idea of vocation, or I should almost say vocations. So vocation, calling, is actually incredibly important in Lutheran thinking, in Lutheran teaching. I had a seminary professor actually who said it this way. He said, really, Lutheranism only has two teachings. Those two teachings are justification and vocation. Those are the two teachings of Lutheranism. And justification, of course, most of this video series, for the most part, has been under the topic of justification. So last week, talking about faith, for example. So justification is, well, how are you justified? Or maybe a better word is, how are you made righteous before God? How are you put in right relationship with God? And so this covers things like the forgiveness of sins. This covers things like absolution. This covers things like faith and trusting in God's promise. And that's all under the topic of justification. In fact, most of what we are doing in the worship service has to do with justification. But then there's this other major teaching of Lutheranism, and that is vocation. That is God's calling or placing on us. And for example, when a couple of these video series, or these videos in this series on things like responding to a pandemic, for example, or how we should think about what our kind of dual citizenship that we have, our heavenly citizenship and our earthly citizenship, and how we weigh those. Those are questions not of justification, not of being right before God, not of being, righteous in a, divine sense, but rather these are questions about what it is to live here in the world. This is a question of vocation. So you have justification and you have vocation. And it's almost better to say that as Lutherans, we don't talk about or teach about vocation, singular, but we talk about vocations. Because our belief is that God has placed us in a web of responsibilities to each other, a web of, or a network, perhaps you could say, of roles that we fill. And throughout our day, we find ourselves acting in all of these various ways in relationships with all of these other people. And in all of those responsibilities and roles that we have, each of those we can identify as a vocation that has been given to us by God. It is a calling that has been placed on us by God. One of the easiest ways, or the most basic ways to look for this vocation, is just to simply think about family relationships. Now, of course, family relationships don't even come close to covering the whole of the vocations that you're placed in. But they're easily identifiable, I think. So, for example, taking myself as an example, I have a whole number of family relationships that I am a part of. So I am, I guess first and foremost, at least chronologically, I am a son, right? I have parents, and so I have a vocation to my parents. That vocation is, governed, you could say, or specified in the commandments, right? So the 10 Commandments: honor your father and your mother. So I have a vocation that is placed on me as being a son to honor my father and my mother. That is a vocation that I have. I also have the vocation of brother, right? So I'm an older brother to a sister, and so that is another vocation, another relationship, another role in which I have a calling from God. So God has gifted me these vocations and gifted me into them. They don't always feel like gifts. I'm not saying anything about my family, but these vocations or relationships that we're placed in don't always feel like gifts, right? They have ups and downs to them, but they are gifts in which God has placed us. So I have a vocation of son, of brother, now of husband and of father. I also have more distant relationships of cousin or nephew or uncle, all of these sorts of relationships. So all of these are different vocations. But of course, I have more vocations than just my family vocations. I also have, I suppose you could say, professional vocations. So I have vocations to serve as a pastor. So I'm called, and we're really good about using this language of call when we talk about pastors. We're not as good about using it when we talk about other vocations, other jobs, but really all of these are vocations. So I have a vocation as pastor. But before that, I had vocations as office assistant, as other jobs that I've had. I worked in construction for a time. I had a vocation as a construction worker, right? I was actually called by God to be working in God's creation through construction and through the relationships I had with my coworkers in that. And outside of this, there's all sorts of other social relationships we're in. So we have vocation of friend, of confidant, of mentor, or mentee, right? On the other side of that, there's actually vocations on both sides. Or vocation as consumer, right? Or as the customer who goes into a store, you are actually fulfilling a vocation. I mean, obviously we know, especially right now in this economic downturn that we're in, we know that, doing things like going shopping actually is helpful for others' well-being. It's helpful for the economy, right? So we have a vocation there, but I also have a vocation with how I carry myself when I go about that. So for example, if I'm going and I'm hassling store employees and I'm, refusing to wear a face mask, even though the rules ask me to wear a face mask, or whatever it is, I'm not fulfilling my vocation to those people, right? I'm not fulfilling God's call on me to those people. And so when we talk about vocation in a Lutheran sense, we're not just talking about one thing, one unique quality that we are called to. We're talking about this network, this web of relationships into which God has placed us. Relationships with those who, we have known from birth, relationships with those who are the closest to us, but also relationships with those who are distant from us, those whose names we do not know, those who we might see, once or even never, right? In this society that we live in, a globalized society where I don't know what percentage, but probably most of the things that I own, for example, were made by people who don't even speak my language, who don't live in this country or on this continent even. I have vocations, or I have relationships to all of these people, and I have vocations, I have callings and responsibility, which comes with those callings in all of these aspects of my life. And so when we talk about vocation, when we think about vocation, we're not thinking about the one big thing. Now, there may be one thing that is bigger than the others, and certainly some of these vocations are more important than other vocations, right? Or more, probably more important, but also more demanding. There's more responsibility placed on them. So, for example, one of the largest or the most weighty vocation that I have personally right now is that of being a father, especially with another baby on the way. That vocation is about to grow, and that responsibility is about to grow, and that call from God is about to grow. Now, why is it important to talk about it in this way? Why do I think it matters to talk about vocations rather than just simply one singular vocation, or even, in its most sort of mundane, the one thing that you do to get most of your money, your job that you perform? Why is it important to talk about vocations? I think it's important, especially for this reason, because when you talk about one singular vocation, it can communicate that God is really only concerned with sort of the big things in your life. So God is only concerned with the big impact you can make on the world, or God is only concerned with your occupation insofar as it's related to the church, for example. I mentioned earlier that we're good about saying we call a pastor, right? That pastors are called to ministry, are called to this occupation. But it's also the case that you are called in other occupations as well. So you can be called as a bus driver. That's a vocation. That's a calling. There's a lot of, we could say ministry, but I don't really want to make everything sound churchy, but there's a lot of service, maybe is a better word there. It really means the same thing as ministry anyway. There's a lot of service that is done in, driving a bus. And, as a father of a kindergartner, I am very appreciative of her bus driver, right? Not that we have bus drivers right now in coronavirus and stay at home and all that, but in the time that she was riding the bus to school, I'm grateful for the bus drivers that she's had, for the people that have watched out for her and the calling that they serve. And so when we talk about vocations, it recognizes that whether you're somebody that the world sees as important, as we could say essential, although that's taking on a different meaning in these days, as somebody who's one of the big movers and shakers, one of the important, indispensable people in the world, or whether you're somebody that's doing something that everybody sees as trivial, you're just a cog in a machine or something like that, or whether it's in your life at home with your family, or even for those who don't have families but have other relationships, friend relationships, or whatever it is, we can still talk about God having a call for that person, God putting vocations on that person, and that even in their daily roles and their daily relationships, their daily vocations, the ordinary vocations they find themselves in, they are actually fulfilling God's purposes for their life, at least to the extent that they are honoring these vocations that God has given them. Instead of making most of life be sort of ordinary and mundane, I guess is the word to use, and then having certain parts be sort of sanctified as holy because they're related to the church or they're big, important enough that everybody acknowledges them as essential or something like that. We can recognize that actually God has sanctified all of our lives, all of the relationships that we're in, by giving them to us as vocations, by giving them to us as good works in which to walk, as we read in Ephesians. And so we don't have to go searching for God's big will for our lives or God's big purpose, to have this, this phrase that gets thrown around, purpose-driven life, right? As though there's one big purpose and that's the one thing that we have to find, and if we miss it, well, that's just too bad. No, God's purpose is actually in every moment of your life, because you are always, you never escape from this web of this network of vocations into which God has placed you. And by living out those vocations, I say honorably, but faithfully is really the word I'm looking for. By living out these vocations faithfully, you are fulfilling God's purpose here for you in your life. And in fact, every relationship in which you find, no matter how deep or how trivial, wherever it is on that relationship of that spectrum of relationships, whether it is somebody you see almost every moment of every day, or somebody you maybe actually never will meet in person, all of those interactions you have, all of those relationships you have, are a moment in which God is calling you to serve. A moment in which those two greatest commandments that Jesus tells us, which come from the Old Testament, by the way, that we are to love God with all that we are, and that we are to love our neighbor as ourselves. Every moment of our day, every relationship that we are in, every role in which God has placed us, which of course these roles shift over our lives, every vocation in which we are active, all of these are under God's call. And by faithfully serving them, we love God with all that we are, and we are to love our neighbors as ourselves in them. And by doing those things, we can know that these are things that God is pleased with us doing. That if we are, as I am, parents, that by faithfully parenting our children, we are honoring God's call on our lives. If we have occupations that we go out of the home to make money, or even at this time, if we're not going out of the home, but we're still working for somebody in order to make a living, that by faithfully fulfilling our roles and the expectations on us, by serving the people that job is designed to serve, by honoring those whom we work for, and being faithful and trustworthy workers, that we are fulfilling God's call in our lives. That for those of us who don't have any occupations, maybe don't have a family, but are in relationships with people in our social circles, our friends, and so on, by being faithful friends, by being trustworthy friends to those people, we are fulfilling God's holy call on our lives. And so when we talk about vocation, this is what we're saying. That in every part of our life, God is calling us, that God has a call for us, and that God has laid out good works for us to walk into, as it says in Ephesians, which I love the wording of it, because it sounds a little bit to me like God almost just lays them in front of us and we sort of trip over them. We're not looking for good works, we just find them. It turns out God has littered our path with good works for us to do, and we just sort of go about doing those works as we love God and we love our neighbor in the midst of our vocations. Now, of course, when we talk about vocation, we're not talking about justification. So it's not as though our faithfulness or our to the extent that we do well in our vocations, it's not as though this is currying us favor with God. It's not as though this is justifying us in God's sight. No, justification is an entirely separate thing. Justification comes about through faith. It comes through God's promise. It comes through the forgiveness of sins given freely, though we do not deserve it. But here in vocation, we're talking about our daily life, which we do these good works not because God needs them, but because our neighbors need them, because God has set them there so that we can be, in a sense, in a weak sense perhaps, but in a sense, co-workers with God in creation, working to build a better creation, whether it's something as large as some public project that everybody recognizes as good, or whether it's just the small kindness that we show the clerk at the checkout counter as we buy our groceries. All of these are vocations that God has placed on us. So I hope that's helpful to you as you think about your life and your vocations. And trust me, once you really start thinking about it, there will be more vocations than you can possibly count. This web, this network of relationships that God has placed us in, this network of vocations that God has placed us in, is incredibly complex. It's I almost want to say miraculously complex. It's really quite awe-inspiring when you start to think about it and you start to realize just how dependent you are on others and how dependent others are on you, and how impossible it is to be totally isolated and not having any interaction with others or interactions with you. I mean, even you think about the products that you use and the people who made them, you're relying on their work day in and day out, and that's a vocation that they're fulfilling. The toilet paper manufacturers, that's a vocation from God. Maybe not one that gets a lot of honor, a bit more honor these days than it usually does, but it's nonetheless a vocation, a sacred, holy vocation that's given from God. So yeah, I hope that this is helpful, and I hope it helps you to identify the sorts of things that God is calling you to do. And if you've been caught up worrying, and I've been there myself, and I've known other people who worry about this, about identifying that one big vocation, that one big calling that God has for you, or something like that, and worrying that you're going to miss that one purpose, that one way of fulfilling God's will for you. I hope that this releases some of that anxiety. Because the fact is that you have been living in God's call for you your entire life, even before you were aware of it. Even as a baby, even infants have vocations, though they are of a much different sort than the vocations that adults have. But even then, you were already living in God's call for you. I hope that's been helpful. This is going to be the second to last of these video series, at least for the time being. So today is the second to last week of May. Next Thursday will be the last Thursday in May. And as we enter into the summer and schedules change a bit, and as my family and I prepare for our new arrival, I'm going to take at least a summer hiatus, or at least most of the summer hiatus, from this weekly video series. I hope that they've been helpful. Again, if there's going to be one more next week, so if there's a burning question that you really would like addressed that hasn't been addressed, let me know, and I'll consider it for next week. But until then, until next week, or until Sunday, if you're following our Sunday morning worships, God bless you, and God be with you, and may God strengthen you in living out your vocations.